Hello, and welcome to the first ever episode of ByteMed, a podcast dedicated to making sense of the fast-evolving world of health AI that is directly relevant to you. I'm Harish, your host and co-director at the Artificial Intelligence and Medical Systems Society. In a field where innovation moves at lightning speed, ByteMed breaks down the latest advances in healthcare technology and artificial intelligence, translating complex breakthroughs into tangible insights that matter to you. Join us as we speak with leading researchers, industry pioneers, and early adopters from both academia and the private sector. Our mission is to help you stay ahead of the curve and understand how these cutting-edge technologies and developments impact your life. Whether you're on the front lines of healthcare or simply curious about its future, let's make the future of healthcare accessible. In today's episode, we have two special guests who will delve into a solution in precision healthcare, specifically for prostate wellness and early prostate cancer detection. But first, let's go around the world to see what is happening today. University of Stanford's senior scholar at the Clinical Excellence Research Center, Nirav Shah, claims that healthcare is becoming less productive. The more technology we get, the less productive we seem to become. The side effects of burdening administrative procedures becomes counterproductive to what the technology is intended to alleviate. A root cause for this issue is that healthcare systems fail to standardize user-centered design and do not seem to prioritize the people using them, the doctors, nurses, and the patients themselves. Now, you definitely heard the term generative AI. Generative AI is being used in all sorts of applications, from creating art and images from prompts to creating a recipe from a few short ingredients that seemed impossible to fit together. Generative AI, or Gen AI in short, is making leaps in healthcare via enabling personalized treatment plans, real-time patient monitoring, and advanced diagnostics. With the future of Gen AI in the healthcare market expected to grow by 30.1% from 2024 to 2030, healthcare providers are already aiming to reduce the burden and costs associated with bloatware with something called value-based redistribution of intensity. Now, that mouthful of a term describes the shifting from matching risk to care intensity to applying more of a targeted touch for higher risk patients with self-service and health IT for lower risk patients. This can be done through improving diagnostic accuracy, enhancing patient care and management, and streamlining administrative processes. Next up, in Canadian healthcare legislation, the Government of Canada introduced the Connected Care for Canadians Act, meant to improve patient safety and access to their health information. Bill C-72 outlines Canada's plan to enable a modern and connected care system, which hopes to see this through by standardizing the way health data and digital tools are accessed and curated by different parties. It is important to know, however, that the federal government is not creating a platform or database of health information, but enables and encourages secure access for patients and secure information sharing between healthcare providers. Data blocking, a form of gatekeeping medical information by health information technology vendors, will become prohibited, another huge step towards increasing accessibility in healthcare data and governance. Lastly, an AI tool cuts down unexpected deaths in hospitals by 26%. A patient at St. Michael's Hospital in downtown Toronto had a cat bite and suffered just a fever at first. However, the AI-based early warning system that they were testing flagged a potentially more serious issue. Upon further diagnosis, the patient's white blood cell count was higher than expected, with the cause turning out to be cellulitis, a very serious and sometimes deadly bacterial skin infection. This tool, called ChartWatch, watches real-time data from electronic medical records to identify or create clinical pathways for high-risk patients. This tool that was implemented between August and October 2020 found a significant reduction of 0.5% in non-palliative deaths among the highest risk general internal medicine patients over a 2-year span, with a 26% reduction over all GI patients. For wider implementation of this tool, investigators are involved with a 35 hospital-wide data sharing network called Gemini, building a huge pool of data resource to allow for AI development and testing. Now, let's jump into our interview today with our guests. Our co-host today will be Sasha Davis, President of the Artificial Intelligence and Medical Systems Society. In today's episode, we have Chief Technology Officer Robert Poprosky and VP of Clinical Engagement Sean Secord from Nanostics, a Canadian commercial stage precision health company specialized in early prediction, aiding in the diagnosis of diseases, combining machine learning and biomarkers. Welcome to the show, Robert and Sean.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for having us.
Yeah, why don't you get started by maybe introducing yourselves?
Okay, I can start. I'm Robert Poprosky. I'm the Chief Technology Officer and co-founder at Nanostics. So I deal with a lot of the software development, machine learning, making the actual product itself for what we do at Nanostics.
And I am Sean Secord. I have a long history as a healthcare clinician and a healthcare leader. I have been tangentially involved with Nanostics since its inception in 2017, but officially joined the team last year.
That's amazing. That's great. Yeah, why don't you maybe tell us about like what started Gnostics and how it got to where it is right now?
Certainly. We can start with a longer story, which is a man named Frank Zajonki, who dealt with the prostate cancer diagnosis in the 90s and 2000s, and he had to travel back and forth between Edmonton and Vancouver. He was a little shocked at the time at the lack of research and innovation in this field. So being a successfully retired businessman with several friends who were well off, he started a Cure Prostate Cancer foundation, and then hired Dr. John Lewis to be the chair of translational oncology, and gave him the task to create a better test for prostate cancer. So John set to work creating the Alberta Prostate Cancer Research Initiative in 2012, as well as forming the world's biggest biobank of prostate cancer-related biofluids, and Lewis Labs at University of Alberta that was dedicated to innovations in prostate cancer research. They continued to do all sorts of innovative approaches to research throughout the 20-teens, and by 2017 had a product in mind, but needed a company to sort of finish that off, to go that last mile from academic research to an accessible test, and thus was formed Nanostics as a precision medicine company to take that research, that last step, to an accessible test for the public.
Okay, that's great. Yeah. So what exactly is Nanostics, and what type of services does Nanostics provide to a person that's interested in using the services?
The research that was done is still going on at University of Alberta and through EPCARI is dedicated to precision medicine, using biomarkers and machine learning to combine to allow diagnosis and better risk modules that are dedicated to screening for cancers and for other conditions. Do you want to take that another step, Robert?
Sure. So I guess we can talk about immediately what we're doing in terms of if people care about what we have now. We have one test right now called ClarityDX prostate. So that test is all about trying to identify which men would have aggressive forms of prostate cancer that need treatment. So an interesting fact is that most men in their 70s and 80s, most of them will have prostate tumors. They'll have prostate cancer, but it'll usually be the low-grade forms they'll end up dying with, but not dying of. But there's some people that have the more aggressive forms, and we need to find these men because if they're more aggressive, they may actually pass away from this disease. So this has been a pretty big clinical unmet need. So this test, ClarityDX prostate, is identifying men that would have, trying to predict which men would have grade group 2 and above prostate cancer on a prostate biopsy before they actually get the biopsy. So yeah, and it's basically a blood test that takes some blood and look at total PSA, which is very specific. PSA is prostate-specific antigen, very specific for the prostate. But normal prostate cells can also produce this protein as well. We look at free PSA, so not just the PSA that's total in the blood, but the ones that's not bound to proteins. And we also look at other clinical features like the patient age, whether or not they've had a previous negative biopsy. If they do, they have a more likely that they won't have aggressive forms of prostate cancer. There may be some other reason that they had a potentially higher PSA. And we also take into account digital rectal information, such as whether or not they had an abnormality during that test. And if it's available, the test can take in different types of features. So some people, like general doctors, won't have MRI data. So we have the version of ClarityDX prostate that doesn't use MRI. But those urologists that specialize in looking at patients further along in prostate cancer management could order MRIs, figure out how big the prostate volume is. And knowing the prostate volume is actually very useful for helping predict if they could have more aggressive forms of disease. If they have a really, really small prostate, but a fairly high PSA, there's potentially bad reason for why that is. If there's some cancer cells somewhere else making all that PSA and they don't have a lot of normal prostate cells. But on the other side, they could have a really, really big prostate and just a medium PSA that might explain why they have that PSA value. Maybe they don't have cancer. MRI can also give us other types of data, such as PIRAD score, which is a way for radiologists to try to look at the images and assess whether or not they believe there could be some suspect lesions that's in the prostate that could correlate with more aggressive forms of prostate cancer. So depending on what information we get, we have multiple models, 4 different models, and we'll give the most accurate risk prediction back to the patient.
What about Nanostics sets you apart from other players in the field?
So one of the interesting things is, I guess we first have to talk about who the other players in the field are. So there's a few other tests that also try and do similar things, such as 4K score. They have 4 different kallikreins. PSA is a kallikrein. So they look at, I can't remember all of them exactly, but we use 2 different kallikreins. So ours is just totally free PSA. They have a couple others as well, kallikrein 2 and something else. So that's actually one of the major costs of these types of tests in terms of the base costs. Because every time you have to do a new lab test, typically you need to buy the kits, and they can cost in the tens of dollars at least. So having only 2 kallikreins compared to 4, and having a fairly similar predictive value for grade group 2 and above prostate cancer based on cross-study comparisons, we need to do a proper study comparison with the same patients, could give us an advantage in terms of cost for the patients, which is really, really important for Canada. Since in Canada we do not spend money on some of these other tests like 4K score that could be $700+. So we can, in theory, provide the test for cheaper. That's one big advantage for us.
Cool.
So you mentioned a really large ratio of people, developing prostate cancer throughout their lifetimes. What was that ratio again that you mentioned?
Oh, in terms of people that could be 70 or 80 years old, and most of them would have prostate tumors.
I see. Yeah. Are enough people really actively keeping up with, their prostate health and getting those regular checkups that maybe they're not daily, but their yearly visit to doctor office, are they getting checked up and contributing towards their prostate health? And if not, how could we increase this?
I'll jump on this one, Robert, because they are not, and that is not the fault of the Canadian public. That is an overcorrection that was done back in the early 2010s. So as Robert had said, prostate-specific antigen, when it leaks into the blood from the prostate, it indicates that there's irritability with the prostate, something going on. But there's a wide range of things. It could be an infection. It could just be an irritation to that area. So PSA is good at what it does, measures irritability of the prostate. Using it as a screening tool for prostate cancer means that 80% of the time that the PSA is elevated, it's elevated for reasons other than prostate cancer. However, it is a very sensitive tool. It's not specific to prostate cancer, but it's sensitive. So back in 1994, Canada started to use it as a screening tool for prostate cancer, because when it's elevated, it's elevated at an early stage, and you can catch that cancer early. When you catch the cancer early, the treatment options are plentiful and much more effective. Catch that cancer early and it's curable. If it's allowed to progress to other tissues, and the prostate's sort of hidden in the middle of the body, so there aren't a lot of signs and symptoms necessarily. So if it's allowed to progress, it's harder to treat. So using PSA to screen for prostate cancer actually reduced the mortality rate throughout the 90s and early 2000s by about 4% year over year. There's a steady decline in mortality due to prostate cancer by using PSA. However, for those people that have an elevated PSA for reasons other than prostate cancer, a lot of them ended up getting a transrectal prostate biopsy. So that is an invasive procedure that comes with the risks of its own. So to reduce the amount of people that were getting harm and they didn't end up having prostate cancer, where there were some recommendations against using PSA for screening, but that was sort of the wrong approach. What should have been said was we need a better test, which is what Nanostics and ClarityDX did. because what we found out in studies in the late 20 teens and early 2020s is that the mortality rate has gone up. And there's a whole generation of healthcare providers that said, oh, we were told not to screen with PSA. So now there's not only the need to get this test, the awareness of this test out to the public, but also healthcare providers who may be relying on information that's a decade old. So we now have a better test. We can now make more men aware of that, more healthcare providers aware of that, and get back to the mortality decreasing rate that we were seeing in the 90s.
Okay, you mentioned of that you could get, the earlier it is that you diagnose and potentially find, a high risk for prostate cancer, the more likely it is that, you can treat that. So using ClarityDX, for example, how early can a screening potentially catch someone with a high risk for a positive diagnosis?
At the very early stages, at that stage when the cancer is potentially curable. So when you catch it early, which ClarityDX has the potential to do, because you use a PSA first. If the PSA is elevated, we'll run the ClarityDX, which gives a predictive score of whether you have a low risk of cancer, and therefore watchful waiting, getting screened in another year or two is the best approach, and you're not exposing men to invasive procedures who don't need them. Or you have a high risk of prostate cancer, and then you're getting prioritized to see a urologist sooner than later. And therefore, treating those cancers sooner has a 5-year survival rate close to 100%. If that cancer is allowed to sort of percolate without being diagnosed and is diagnosed at a later stage, the 5-year survival rate is closer to 30%.
Okay, yeah, that's amazing actually. As a patient, a potential patient that's looking into, getting a diagnosis, what is like a normal procedure for someone coming into the clinic and using the ClarityDX?
Well, first, the patients would talk to their healthcare provider about the pros and cons of screening. Generally, we'd want to get all men screened by age 50. If there's a family history or any sort of symptoms or uncertainties, you could do that earlier, like 40 or 45. So the first step is to get a PSA test. And if that PSA test is negative, there's nothing going on with the prostate. The negative predictive value of PSA is quite high, so you can be reassured, negative PSA, you're good. But if the PSA is over 3, that's when you'd want to run the ClarityDX prostate, which is another blood test. Available now as a private pay test, which means you need a requisition, a few clinical features filled out by your physician, and then be able to pay a fee for the test and go to a lab. But you're just going to any lab that collects the blood for your PSA. In certain provinces, will be able to do it for ClarityDX prostate as well.
Okay, that's cool. Yeah, no, that's great because people want to know how exactly, this whole process works and how, it's because a lot of there's a lot of tools out there, a lot of services out there, and it's really difficult to understand what's really relevant to a potential patient. And so that's really informative. Yeah, I had a question about where Nanostics is maybe headed in the field because, it's predictive analytics in healthcare, right? This falls kind of under that realm. And maybe the short term versus the long term, like where is Nanostics exactly headed, and where do you see it being in the larger scheme of Canada's healthcare?
I can take that. In the short term, we're doing a lot of work trying to get ClarityDX available to everyone. So right now, as Sean mentioned, it's patients will pay for it. So obviously, that's not the ideal situation. We're working a lot on trying to get reimbursement with governments and different insurance agencies. And right now, we are available throughout many provinces in Canada, but we really want to focus in the United States. There's a lot more people there. So it makes good business sense, and it's good to have that available to them as well for the clinic. That's more the short term. We have more aspirations for the long term to be able to make multiple tests. So the platform that we use to make these types of predictive models, it's not like it's specific towards just prostate cancer. We can do these sorts of model creation for any type of disease as long as we have good data sets for them. So we've been in talks with Alberta Health Services about wanting to make predictive models with some of the data that they have. So we have some agreements in place that we should be able to, we can't take in the data out of Alberta Health Services, that's just some privacy risks there. But we're building tools to help allow them to better analyze the data that they have in order to make some of these predictive models to predict different types of diseases that may be of value. to the clinic and then get those models out and we can help commercialize them. Those are still in the early stage of these collaborations, so it'll take probably some years before we get there to some other useful products. But in terms of long term, there's a lot of opportunity there.
I wanted to know quickly, how does the machine learning pipeline work that you use, and how are the associated biomarkers kind of folded into it, and how are they used?
Yeah. So we actually are building a program to really simplify this, since we're going to be, specifically with AHS, I have a lot of code that does this in Python. But if we want people from AHS to be able to use this, that's going to be very difficult. There's not a lot of machine learning experts with Python in our health services. So we've been building this summer to have a graphical user interface program that'll do a lot of the functionality that we do for building the models, but so that anyone can actually use it. It basically just allows you to identify the data set that you care about. It should be something like a spreadsheet, such as a CSV file or something like that. And then typically you have your different rows as your different patients or observations, and you have your columns as different features. Features that you either use to make a prediction, or it could be a target that you're trying to predict. Those are just your columns in your spreadsheet. And so the program itself, you just identify what you want to use as potential features and what it is you're trying to predict. And it has a bunch of different functionality for feature selection, different ways to do feature selection, identify which features are actually useful in making models and which ones we don't have predictive value, we shouldn't bother with them. It has the ability to use a variety of different machine learning algorithms, not just the traditional logistic regression that's used in the clinic a lot, but also anything up to support vector machines, XGBoost, some of the types of machine learning algorithms that do really well in Kaggle machine learning competitions for tabular-based data sets. It has the ability to do calibrations, such as using either isotonic calibration or sigmoid calibrations, so that you have better predictions that better match what you see in terms of the probability that someone would actually have the disease of interest. It can also do ensembling, so you don't have just one model, but you make many, many models using bootstrapping to maximize the performance of your final model. So all that's kind of wrapped into this one program. So it's actually pretty close to being finalized, so we're looking forward to seeing how it's going to be used.
Yeah, that's super exciting. I wanted to know, at inference time, how much time or computational cost does that normally take to arrive at a prediction for someone? And I guess what percentage of the total time between the patient walking in for their appointment and receiving their score does that take? And I guess how long is that?
The inference time when it comes to machine learning is like seconds, a few seconds. And it would honestly be faster than that if we weren't also generating SHAP values, which is basically taking the model and trying to explain how each of the features contributed to the final probability. That's what takes the most time. Without that, it would take a split second. But anyways, it's a small amount of time. Most of the time is sense in terms of like someone filling out the requisition form with their doctor, all the information that we need to put on the report and to do inference with our models. And then that going with the patients, going to the blood collection center, getting the blood drawn for them, that blood going to our lab, and then our lab running total free PSA. So all of that takes way, way more time than the actual machine learning inference time.
Would clinicians
way,
be
way
looking
more
at?
time.
Oh,
Sorry, I was just
go
saying that
ahead.
way more time is still within probably 2 days. So somebody who has a requisition in their hand one day is going to have the result with their healthcare provider within 2 days.
Great. Awesome. Yeah. And so what I was just going to jump in and ask was, are the clinicians looking at the SHAP values? Is that used to market the tool? I know explainability is super duper important. So who's really looking into that?
Yeah, so we have it specifically for clinicians and for patients. Patients are actually paying for this test. We want to make sure they can try to understand this too.
Yeah.
Because I know a lot of these models they're very much black box. And for ClarityDX prostate, we have a publication on it that goes a little bit into the methods. We do use a whole bunch of ensembles of calibrated random forests. And once you start dealing with decision trees, trying to understand hundreds of decision trees, how it makes its final prediction is very, very complicated. So having those final SHAP values saying age, affected your risk of grade group 2 and above prostate cancer plus 4% or minus 2%, depending on what the age was. I think that really does. I think it helps the doctors a lot too to try and trust the model, as opposed to, I don't know how you even gave me this score. If they can look at that and say, okay, that makes sense, it's more likely they'll actually want to keep using it and make recommendations based on it.
Yeah, what have clinicians and so clinicians that are administering these services to their patients and the patients themselves, like what has been like the sort of feedback that they have been giving on ClarityDX?
For the most part, it's been very positive. It's difficult when you have patients that want to know information, and then you have some recommendations. And like I said, those recommendations are over a decade old now. But if a clinician hasn't really listened to see what the updates are, then they're feeling frustrated that they can't help their patients, get more information. Nobody likes to live with uncertainty. So the ability to have more answers without exposing somebody to an invasive test unnecessarily has been well received by clinicians, by patients, and hopefully with time by guideline agencies and government agencies across the country, that this will become standard of care.
That's great. Yeah, that was amazing. Thank you so much for your time, Robert and Sean. We learned a lot about Nanostics today, and yeah, prostate cancer and prostate health is very important, and it definitely deserves to be up there in terms of getting a checkup every year. And yeah, exactly. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.